Have you ever dealt with a person so drunk on a tiny sliver of power that they start to believe their own rules are more important than actual laws? I have. Her name was Carol, and she was the self-appointed queen of my neighborhood, the president of our homeowners association. All I ever wanted was to be left alone in the one place that was truly mine, my workshop. It was a detached two-car garage I had converted into a sanctuary of electronics, soldering fumes, and meticulously organized tools. It was where I unwound, where I tinkered, and where I ran my one-man business designing and installing high-end, bespoke security systems for people who took their privacy as seriously as I did. For 2 years, things were fine. Then Carol was elected. Suddenly, the color of my mailbox was non-compliant, my meticulously manicured zoysia grass was a 1/4 inch too high, and my recycling bin was visible from the street for 3 hours too long on trash day. Each nitpick came with a smarmy, condescending letter and a fine. I paid them, wanting only peace. But then she set her sights on my workshop. An official letter, stiff with self-importance, arrived, citing an obscure bylaw about unapproved commercial operations. It demanded a full inspection. What Carol and the rest of her board didn't know was that my workshop was more than just a place for tools and projects. It was a fortress of my own design, and a queen was about to storm a castle she couldn't possibly comprehend. This is the story of how my HOA broke into my private space and how I used my very particular set of skills to ensure they would never, ever bother me again. Have you ever been pushed so far that your only option was to push back with everything you had? My first response to the HOA's letter was, of course, the reasonable one. I typed up a polite, professional email explaining that my business was a registered LLC, that my work involved design and off-site installation, and that my workshop was purely for research, development, and personal projects. I offered to provide them with redacted tax documents or business registration paperwork to prove that no customers ever came to my home and no commercial activity, as defined by zoning laws, took place there. I was extending an olive branch, trying to de-escalate a situation that was already absurd. Carol's reply came less than an hour later. It was dismissive and dripping with condescension. "Mr. Davis," it began, "the bylaws are quite clear. The board has the authority to inspect any structure on the property to ensure compliance. Your paperwork is irrelevant. We need to see for ourselves that you are not running a manufacturing facility or storing prohibited materials." The sheer arrogance was stunning. She was ignoring my evidence, my privacy, and the law, all in favor of her own imagined authority. I replied again, this time a bit more firmly, quoting the state property codes that clearly define the limits of an HOA's inspection powers. They had no right to enter a locked, detached structure without my consent or a court order. Her response to that was to simply double the fine for non-cooperation and add a deadline. If I did not grant them access within 10 days, they would levy a special assessment against my property for every day of noncompliance. It was extortion, plain and simple, wrapped in the guise of neighborhood governance. The letters became a weekly occurrence, each one more threatening than the last. They were building a paper trail they thought would protect them, a mountain of fines and warnings that would make them look like the patient, law-abiding party, when, in reality, they were the aggressors. This is a classic tactic of the petty tyrant. Create a crisis, then punish the victim for not submitting to the tyrant's solution. But as I read her latest demand, a cold, clear thought cut through my frustration. She wasn't just going to keep sending letters. Her ego wouldn't allow it. Eventually, she would overplay her hand. And when she did, I would be ready. The final letter was the turning point. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that an official inspection will be conducted on or before the 30th of the month, with or without your presence, to ensure compliance with community standards. This was it. This was the declaration of war. They had just put in writing their intent to commit criminal trespassing. My anger, which had been simmering for weeks, cooled into a sharp, diamond-hard resolve. My days of polite emails and reasonable offers were over. It was time to stop reacting and start planning. My mind shifted from that of a frustrated homeowner to that of a security designer. The problem was no longer Carol's ego. The problem was an imminent, unauthorized breach of a secure facility. And I knew exactly how to handle that. I spent the next few days preparing my workshop not for a defense, but for a welcome. I wanted them to get in. I needed them to. Their arrogance was my greatest ally, and I was going to use it to spring a trap they couldn't even imagine. The workshop was already a formidable space. The single entry point was a heavy, steel-reinforced door. The windows were small, high, and fitted with decorative but very solid iron bars I'd install myself. The entire structure was essentially a metal box, but its real strength was in the systems I had built into it. The main lock was a commercial-grade electromagnetic lock, a maglock, capable of holding against 1,200 pounds of force. It was tied into a keypad on the outside, but it also had a remote, encrypted wireless override controlled only by my phone. This was key. I reviewed the camera placements. 4 ultra-high-definition cameras covered every square inch of the interior, and a fifth, a pinhole camera, was concealed in a birdhouse I'd mounted on a tree, giving me a perfect view of the workshop's exterior and the door. All feeds were recorded to a secure cloud server and backed up locally on a hidden drive. Audio was also enabled. Every word they spoke inside would be captured. I knew they would feel emboldened, thinking I was at my day job, unaware. But I would be watching. I was no longer building a case to defend myself against fines. I was building a case to prosecute them for their crimes. The strategy was simple, elegant, and entirely dependent on my opponent's hubris. They believed the workshop was just a garage. They believed I was just some nerdy guy they could bully. They believed their HOA documents were a shield that made them invincible. My plan would use all 3 of these misconceptions to hang them by their own rope. The core of the trap was the door. I programmed a new temporary code into the exterior keypad, 1234. It was an insultingly simple code, a welcome mat for idiots. I wanted them to feel clever, as if they'd guessed it or found vulnerability. This was crucial. I couldn't leave the door unlocked. They needed to perform an action to enter, to cross that legal threshold themselves. By entering a code, even a simple one, and opening the door, they would be demonstrating clear intent. Once inside, a laser tripwire, invisible to the naked eye and positioned just inside the doorway, would send a silent alert directly to my phone. It wouldn't trigger an alarm or a siren. It would simply tell me the trap had been sprung. From that moment on, I would have them. I could watch them, listen to them, and let them wander around, gathering all the evidence I needed. The final piece of the puzzle was the maglock's remote override. Once they were both inside, I was certain Carol would bring her smarmy vice president, Gary, for backup. I would tap a single icon on my phone. This command would do 2 things simultaneously. It would engage the 1,200-pound maglock, sealing the door completely, and it would disable the exterior keypad. There would be no getting out. They would be contained in a secure, windowless, sound-dampened room with no cell service, utterly at my mercy. I spent an evening testing everything. I walked through the scenario a dozen times. The alert system was flawless. The lock was instantaneous. The audio and video were crystal clear. This wasn't just about catching them. It was about creating a perfect, undeniable record of their actions from start to finish. I was crafting a legal masterpiece with circuits and code. As the 30th of the month approached, I sent one last formal email. It was a masterpiece of legal restraint. To the HOA board, I wrote, "This is a final notice that I do not consent to any inspection of my private, locked workshop without my presence and legal counsel. Any attempt to enter my property without a warrant will be considered criminal trespassing, and I will pursue all available legal remedies." I made sure to save a copy of the email and the delivery receipt. I was baiting the hook, and Carol, bless her arrogant heart, swam right for it. Her reply was the final piece of evidence I needed before the main event. It was short, smug, and dripping with the kind of overconfidence that only comes from someone who has never been truly challenged. "Mr. Davis," she wrote back, "your threats are noted. The board's duties, as outlined in the covenants you agreed to when you purchased your home, are not subject to your personal preferences. The inspection will proceed as scheduled to protect the interests of the community." She was so convinced of her own righteousness. She genuinely believed that a neighborhood contract superseded state and federal law. She had her binder of rules, and to her, that was the only scripture that mattered. I smiled as I saved her email. It was perfect. It was a written confession of intent. She had been given a clear, final warning and had dismissed it with contempt. Any lawyer would call this mens rea, the intention or knowledge of wrongdoing. The stage was set. The actors were primed. My fortress was waiting, its digital arms open wide. I went about my week, projecting an air of normalcy. I mowed my lawn. I brought my trash cans promptly. I waved politely to my neighbors. I wanted to give Carol and her cronies no reason to suspect that I was anything but a defeated man anxiously awaiting their inevitable invasion. Their overconfidence was now my primary weapon, and I had just finished sharpening it to a razor's edge. All I had to do now was wait. The evening of the 28th was quiet. A light rain was falling, muffling the sounds of the neighborhood. I was in my home office, ostensibly working, but in reality, I had a single window open on my monitor, the live feed from the birdhouse camera. It was pointed directly at the workshop door. At 9:47 p.m., a car I recognized as Carol's pulled up and parked down the street, its lights off. Two figures emerged, huddled under an umbrella. It was Carol, and just as I predicted, her loyal bulldog, Gary. They scurried along the sidewalk, darting up my driveway like clumsy burglars in a comedy sketch. My heart began to pound, not with fear, but with a cold, thrilling surge of adrenaline. This was it. They approached the workshop door. Gary pulled out a high-powered flashlight, playing it over the keypad as Carol held the umbrella. I watched them confer, their body language a mixture of nervousness and self-righteous determination. Gary, ever the stooge, tried the doorknob first. It was locked, of course. Then he started pressing random numbers on the keypad. I could almost hear his grunts of frustration. After a few failed attempts, Carol pushed him aside. I saw her punch in a sequence. Her own house number. Nothing. Then her birthday. Nothing. Finally, with an exasperated sigh, she tried the simplest combination possible. 1-2-3-4. A tiny green light blinked on the keypad. The lock clicked. The door swung inward into the darkness of the workshop. They paused for a moment. Then, with a shared look of triumphant glee, they stepped inside, crossing the invisible laser tripwire. My phone buzzed silently in my pocket. The trap was sprung. I gave them a full minute, watching on my interior cameras as they clicked on their flashlights and began to snoop. Carol ran her white-gloved hand over my workbench, checking for dust. Gary was opening my sealed component drawers, peering at my circuit boards as if he had any idea what he was looking at. They were violating my space, my work, my sanctuary. The anger flared hot, but I channeled it. With a slow, deliberate movement, I lifted my phone, opened the control app, and tapped the icon labeled Containment Protocol through my computer speakers connected to the workshop's audio feed. I heard the satisfying, heavy thump of the maglock engaging. For the first few minutes, they didn't even notice. They were too engrossed in their pathetic little power trip, rifling through my things, murmuring to each other about what they could write me up for. "Look at this, Gary." Carol's voice crackled through my speakers, sharp and clear. "All this wiring. It's a fire hazard for sure. We can definitely fine him for this," Gary muttered his agreement, shining his flashlight on a rack of neatly spooled cables. They were completely oblivious, convinced they were the masters of this little universe. Their smugness was so thick I could practically taste it. They spent another 5 minutes on their pointless search before finally deciding they had enough ammunition. "All right, let's go," Carol said, a note of finality in her voice. "We have everything we need to call a special meeting." I watched as Gary walked to the door and pulled the handle. Nothing happened. He pulled it again, harder, rattling it in its frame. "It's stuck," he said, a hint of confusion in his voice. "What do you mean it's stuck?" Carol snapped, walking over. "You opened it just fine." She grabbed the handle herself and yanked with all her might. The heavy steel door didn't move a millimeter. It was now part of the wall. The panic started to creep into their voices. "The keypad isn't working," Gary said, his voice rising. "The light is off." They were trapped. The full realization washed over them. visible even in the grainy night vision of the camera. They were locked inside the very building they had illegally entered. Their flashlights started darting around nervously, illuminating the barred windows, the solid walls, and the single, unyielding door. The hunter had become the prey, and the cage had just snapped shut. The silence was broken by Gary pounding his fist on the door, a hollow, metallic boom that echoed in the small space. It was the sound of their authority, their arrogance, their entire world of petty rules, crashing against a wall of solid steel and cold, hard reality. The banging on the door became frantic. Carol's imperious tone had evaporated, replaced by a shrill, panicked yelling. "Hello? Is anyone out there? Let us out." It was music to my ears. I let them stew in their self-made prison for a full 10 minutes, watching them devolve from smug inspectors to terrified trespassers. I save a particularly choice clip of Gary trying to use his phone, his face illuminated by the screen, showing a no-service message. My workshop was a very effective Faraday cage. Finally, when their panic had reached its peak, I decided it was time for the next phase. I calmly picked up my phone and dialed the county sheriff's non-emergency number. "Yes, hello," I said, my voice steady and calm. "My name is Mark Davis. I live at 124 Willow Creek Lane. I'd like to report a breaking and entering in progress. I have 2 individuals who have successfully broken into my detached workshop. The good news is I have them contained inside the building right now." The dispatcher was silent for a beat, then asked me to repeat myself. I did, clarifying every detail. While still on the line with the dispatcher, who was now sending a patrol car, I toggled the switch for the external speaker on the workshop. "Carol? Gary." I spoke into my phone's microphone, my voice booming from the speaker just outside the door they were pounding on. "Is there a problem? You seem to be having some trouble with the door." The silence that followed was profound. I could see them on camera, frozen in place, their faces a perfect blend of shock, rage, and pure, unadulterated fear. "Davis!" Carol shrieked, her voice thin and tinny through the audio feed. "You did this. You locked us in. This is illegal. This is kidnapping." I chuckled. "Now, Carol, let's be professional. According to your own letters, this is an official inspection. I'm just ensuring it's a very, very thorough one. Also, for your information, you are being recorded and the sheriff's department is on its way. I'd advise you to think very carefully about what you say next. The trap wasn't just the locked door. It was the entire, perfectly documented scenario I had lured them into. They were no longer HOA board members. They were just 2 criminals caught in the act with no way out. 2 patrol cars rolled up my driveway. Less than 5 minutes later, their blue and red lights painting the rainy night in strobing colors. I walked out my front door to meet them, phone in hand, the very picture of a calm, concerned homeowner. A tall, stern-looking deputy met me on the porch. "You're the one who called?" he asked, his eyes scanning me, the house, and the workshop where the faint sound of yelling could still be heard. "Yes, sir. Mark Davis," I said, extending a hand. "Thank you for the quick response. The 2 individuals who broke in are still secured inside." I showed him the live feed on my phone. He watched for a moment as Carol and Gary paced like caged animals. "They claim they're from the HOA, here for an inspection," I explained. However, they were notified in writing that I did not consent to their entry, and they forced their way in after hours. I then showed him the email from Carol, the one where she explicitly stated her intent to enter regardless of my consent. The deputy's expression hardened. He'd seen this kind of small-town power play before. "And you locked them in?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "The security system engaged automatically when it detected an unauthorized breach," I replied smoothly. "It's designed to contain intruders until authorities arrive." He nodded slowly, understanding completely. "All right, Mr. Davis. Can you open the door for us?" "Of course, deputy." He and his partner took up positions on either side of the workshop door. I tapped the override command on my phone. With a loud click, the maglock disengaged. The door swung open, and Carol and Gary stumbled out, blinking in the flashing lights, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. They immediately launched into a tirade. "Arrest him!" Carol shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. He trapped us. He held us against our will. The deputy simply held up a hand, silencing her. Ma'am, we'll get to that. First, I need you to explain why you were inside a building that the owner had expressly forbidden you to enter after dark without his permission. The color drained from Carol's face. Her entire defense, her entire worldview, was based on the idea that her HOA authority was absolute. In the face of actual law enforcement, it crumbled into dust. She had no answer. She and Gary stood there, speechless, as the consequences of their arrogance finally, and very publicly, came crashing down upon them. The aftermath was even more satisfying than I could have imagined. Carol and Gary were not arrested that night, but they were formally cited for misdemeanor criminal trespassing. The deputies took detailed statements from everyone in my video evidence, including their illegal entry and their panic confessions inside the workshop, was submitted as official evidence. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The following week, a special emergency HOA meeting was called. The community room was packed. People I'd only ever nodded to before were coming up to me, shaking my hand, thanking me. It turned out Carol's reign of terror had affected nearly everyone. My stand was the catalyst they had been waiting for. I stood before the community, and with the calm precision of a technician detailing a system failure, I laid out the facts. I played a short, edited video on a projector. Carol and Gary forcing the door, their gleeful entry, their snooping, and finally, their panicked realization of being trapped. I then displayed the email where Carol had declared her intent to enter my property illegally, followed by a copy of the police report. The room was silent, then erupted. Carol and Gary, sitting at the board table, shrank under the weight of 100 angry stares. They were humiliated, stripped of their power, exposed as the petty tyrants they were. By the end of the meeting, the entire HOA board had tendered their resignations. We elected an interim board on the spot, composed of reasonable people who understood that an HOA's job is to maintain property values, not to violate the rights of homeowners. The fines against me were, of course, voided, and a formal apology from the HOA was entered into the public record. My life returned to the peaceful state I had always wanted. My workshop is once again my sanctuary, but now it stands as a quiet monument to a victory won not with anger, but with logic and preparation. I learned that the best way to deal with a bully is not to stoop to their level, but to use their own momentum and arrogance to trip them up. The law and a little bit of clever engineering are a powerful combination. A person's home, their private space, is their castle. And every castle deserves a good defense system. So let me ask you, what fortress have you had to defend, and how did you ensure the invaders never came back?